Everyone, welcome back to the Ranger Shop. So in this episode we're going to cover solid axle swaps in our Rangers. So we're going to talk about a few things. First off, why bother doing it? Second, what are the options that we have to do it, to make that solid axle swap? And then third, the different ways to install that axle. Leaf springs, coil springs, linked. So if you're interested in this topic, if you're thinking about lifting your Ranger, or if you're thinking about doing a solid axle swap, let me know what you think below. Let's discuss it a little bit. First off, let's talk about why I think that this is something that I'm going to do. Let me show you first off a few of the problems I've got. Okay, so the first problem and the reason why I'm thinking of doing this solid axle swap is to actually get lift, like suspension lift, on our trucks. The way that they do it is, since it's independent suspension, that center section, which is your diff and the axle tubes and stuff, has to be dropped. So they give you diff relocation brackets that drop your diff, whatever the amount of lift. But what happens is that makes it weak. That whole thing, that whole system can move side to side because there's a tremendous amount of load underneath here. So then a lot of guys, they'll go and they'll weld different brackets. They'll try and reinforce those things. But again, you're just reinforcing something that's weak. And we've got other issues. So one of the things with my truck that I've got is I've got a front locker in here. It's one of those lunchbox lockers. It's a great thing, and I love it, especially for the type of wheeling I do. I'm often out alone. I'm towing my trailer. I need lots of traction. And it's beautiful. You can put one tire on a rock and just slowly crawl up it without any wheel spin. It's just amazing. But because of that locker, it's putting a lot of stress on my front end, and especially on my steering. So the steering in these trucks is a rack and pinion steering. I put a new rack in it probably about 2 years ago now, and with the bigger tires and especially with that locker, it's already getting play in the rack. There's probably about a 1/4 inch to 1/2 inch play back and forth, so that's quite a bit. So it's going to need another rack, steering rack, put in it, which is getting very expensive. So that's another downside. The third reason, because of that locker that's in there, I think my front drive shaft, I'll just show you a picture of it here. So the front drive shafts, the way that it works is basically it's like a CV axle, very similar to a CV axle, but it can only do about 4 degrees, which is okay, but it's also weak. And because of the locker, because of the wear and tear, mine's got a lot of play in it right now. It clunks, it groans, it's got a lot of problems. To make this truck work for me, I'd have to buy a lift, do that drop, reinforce all of those brackets, replace my steering rack, replace my front drive shaft, and then in the end I still have this really weak front end that, because of this locker, because of the towing I'm doing, it's not really up to the strength. So that's why I've been thinking a lot about doing this solid axle swap. So let's talk about that. What are some options for solid axle swapping? Let's jump into the garage. Okay, so what options do we have now for axles? Let's talk about that a little bit. So the first option, one that's very commonly put into our trucks, is Dana 30. So Dana 30 is a little bit weaker. We'll talk about that in a second. But first of all, where do we find them? Well, they're often in the XJs, Jeep Cherokees, and also in some TJs. You want to try and find one though that doesn't have the axle disconnect in it. On the passenger side, you'll see that bulge there. So what's the benefits of using Dana 30? Well, first off, you've got the right width. Your front axle isn't sticking out any further than your back axle. Second, it's the right bolt pattern. So that's a real bonus. You got some nice rims you love, tires, you just slap them on, they're good to go. Third good reason, there's a lot of aftermarket support for those axles. So then that's 3 good solid reasons why you might use a Dana 30. Why not? Well, first off, it's a weaker axle. If you've got the old twin traction beam Rangers, 97 back, you're actually downgrading to put that axle in. Also, the spring mounts on either side are narrower than our Ranger frame. So to install those, you need to actually French or cut in the spring buckets into the frame so that the springs are straight up. Otherwise, often you'll see when guys do them, they're like this. So that's our first option, a Dana 30. Let's talk about another option, a Dana 44. So now we're getting into a bigger, heavier, beefier axle. But there is, the first one we're going to talk about is the early Bronco or the Wagoneer, Jeep Wagoneer axle. So those both have the pumpkin in the right side, and they're both the same, well, relatively very close to the same width. So there's some very good benefits. The downside to that though is it's got a low pinion. So the early Broncos, they've got a low pinion in them. It's not the high pinion, so they're much weaker. Also, they've got weaker U-joints on the axles, and you're still going to have to change your bolt pattern. So the bolt pattern is different than the Ranger, so you're going to have to change that bolt pattern. So you might have gotten a little beefier axle, but when you're thinking about a Dana 30 or a Dana 44 from the early Bronco, it's probably better just to go with the Dana 30 with the high pinion and the beefier U-joints. Okay, so that's the early Bronco, but now what about the full size Dana 44? So from the 76 to 79 F-150 4x4. Let's talk about the benefits. So first off, the first benefit is it's a high pinion. So you've got the strength there. So you've got a bigger, beefier axle, a bigger ring gear, and you've got the high pinion, which is better for strength. You've got the bigger U-joints on the axle, so that's a good thing also. There's good support for them. So what are the negatives then of using a Dana 44 the full width? Well, a few things. First off, as mentioned, you're too wide now. So your Ford Ranger is 60 inches wide. Your Dana 44 is 65 inches wide. So you've got 5 inches extra, 2.5 inches on either side sticking out. So then you need fender flares, you need to maybe get some rims that suck it in. There's a lot of different options of how to mitigate that, but it's just something to keep in mind. Your bolt pattern's changed. It's the 5 lugs on 5.5. The 78 and 77, they've got cast on wedges. So those are the parts on the axle where the radius arm, those old radius arms used to bolt onto, those are cast on. If you're thinking of linking, doing like a 3-link, a 4-link on your axle, now it's very difficult to weld to that cast iron. The earlier ones were welded on wedges, and you can cut those off and then you can put your links on there. Those would be the things you want to keep in mind with the Dana 44. So now let's jump to the next axle, the Dana 60. So Dana 60, that's a 1-ton axle. Often the ones that everybody's recommending, and I don't know if this is something I haven't researched that much, but they're recommending, I think it's 2006 and up, F350s, 450. They're big, heavy axles. Okay, so for the Dana 60, just a few things to keep in mind. First off, what's good is the strength. It's unbelievably strong. It's the best one if you want to run big tires. 38 to 44 inch tires are perfect for a Dana 60. You can put the locker in the front, it'll be solid. The things to keep in mind though is the width. Of course, it's much wider. I think it's over 70 inches wide, maybe 74, 75 inches wide. So that's quite a bit wider than your Ranger. Maybe it's more conducive to a trail rig, like something that's just going to be on the trails. You need bigger tires just to get that ground clearance underneath your pumpkin, because your front diff, because your diff is so much bigger now, you can't just go and throw 33-inch tires on. Your ground clearance will be less, much less than if you just used a Dana 30 or a Dana 44 or just kept it with the IFS. So you need to run bigger tires just to take advantage of that strength and to get that clearance underneath that pumpkin, because it's so big. So that's just a few things to keep in mind about the axles. So now let's talk about how we're going to attach those axles onto the vehicle. So there's a few different ways to do this. A couple of the common ways to do that is, first of all, leaf springs. This is something that I thought about, and there's some good benefits to leaf springs. First off, they're easy to install. You're just mounting up a couple mounts and you're done. You're not figuring out geometry and angles and stuff. Simple and strong. cheaper, probably a little bit cheaper to do because you're just buying a couple leaf springs, you're not worrying about all the brackets and stuff. Not as much welding to do. So then what's the downside? First off, you have a rougher ride usually, unless you get custom made leaf springs. You know, if you get custom made some Denver leaf springs or something, then it's beautiful. You can get a really nice ride out of it. But for most of us, we're just buying off the shelf leaf springs for a vehicle that's not a Ford Ranger. So the leaf springs are either thicker, too heavy, or they're too soft, or they're too much of a lift, so then you don't have the flex from the leaf springs. So that's something to keep in mind, the ride. The second thing would be the flex, depending on the leaf springs again that you buy. If you buy some custom leaf springs that are meant for flexing, or that are not too stiff, or that are not too arched, then it'll be great. It flexes like crazy. But for the most of us, again, you're buying maybe some Wagoneer with a 4-inch lift. So you got an arch, you got a Wagoneer's heavier vehicle, so they're thicker, heavy duty springs. You might not get the flex that you want out of them. Where you want to put the shackle, you're going to put the shackle at the front or the back. If you put it on the back, then when they flex, that's dropping, your pinion drops, so you got to have a really long extension on your drive shaft. You also get a little bit more bump steer and stuff with those type setups. So that's the negative to the leaf spring. Also too, because the leaf spring, where it comes up off the axle, it can interfere with your steering. They usually run just your normal steering, and they might run like a high steer arm off of it up to the steering box. Also for me, when I was thinking about this, just because obviously you can see in the background, here's the axles that I've got. This is a Dana 44. And the guy that I got them from, he was running them on a TJ with leaf springs. So I had the leaf springs, and I've just been, you know, just doing some measuring and stuff around there just to see how it fits. And one thing I've noticed is that when you figure out, just take a look at this here. I'll just show you a little video here. So notice with the springs on top, you've got your axle perch first off on top of your axle. Then you've got the spring, so you got the thickness of your pack. I think Wagoneer springs are about 2.5 inches. Then you've got the plate on top of that. Then you've got the bolts that are sticking up a little bit, your U-bolts. So altogether, you're losing about 3 to 4 inches of up travel, like between the axle tube and your frame, which is all your leaf springs, everything, all that's packed in there. So this is a detriment, I think, if you want to run a lower setup, like if you don't want your truck really jacked up in the air. If you want to run leaf springs under the axle, it would cure that, but then again, you've got the high arch or really low truck. That's what made me go with the radius arms that I'm going to talk about later. Okay, now let's jump back into this. Let's talk about linking it, putting in, say, a 3-link or a 4-link front suspension. So what that is basically is you buy brackets that you weld onto the axle tube or onto the axle, or in the case of, let's say, a Jeep Cherokee, like you use an XJ axle, it's already got the brackets on it, so you could use the existing brackets and tie into those. First of all, what's the benefit? They flex good. 3-link, 4-links flex good. They've got good adjustability. Like you can adjust in your caster, like I mentioned, pretty easy. You don't need a long slip yoke on your drive shaft. So what's the negatives then to linking? The negatives are a result of not doing the homework and not building the setup right. So there's some fantastic online link calculators. So if you're considering linking your diff, go to a calculator and figure out exactly the length of arms you need. Like if you're going to put your lower arm here and at this angle up, and your upper arm here and this angle, what will be the characteristics? You know, like when you step on the brakes, how much dive will you get? Will you have a rough ride over bumps? There's a lot of different things based on the angle of those arms, whether it's pushing down or whether it's riding level. How far are you dropping the back mount? There's a ton of research that goes into it, but if done right, it's really, really good. But often the problem is it's not done right. It's just something slapped together and then you have problems. But also, just our vehicles are not built to have links in there. So you've got the exhaust coming down both sides. So now you've got this link that's coming up where the exhaust should be. You've got our diff with the drive shaft. There's just a lot of moving parts within that area that you got to make sure that it clears. So your starter's over there if you're going to run that top link off of the top of the diff. Also, to do that, so let's say you mount your top link right on top of the diff there. Well, then look at now how much clearance you lose on up travel, because now you've got this big bracket on top where your link is that's got to go up, and it can run into the oil pan, it can run into your starter. There's so many things there. So rather than just the height of the pumpkin, you've added now that link on top. If you put it onto the axle tube, it's much weaker there. Like, let's say that you put the fourth link or your third link here. You could put it so that it's running right up by where the oil filter is, right around that area. And that might work okay. But this is a weak area, because now basically your whole third link is based off of the plug welds and the welds of this tube that's in the diff here. So you can't get as much up travel out of that often, that system. So what you'll notice a lot of times when people link their Rangers, or when they run Leafs, it's very high. You're running like big tires. You've got to have a lot of clearance. And even though you've got, let's say you've got like 12 inches, 13 inches clearance between the diff and the motor, by the time you take out the link or the leaf springs, you've actually only got maybe 4 or 5 inches up travel before it hits something. So then you run your bump stops, and you've got to really limit that travel. So that's the reason why, moving on to our third thing, I went with radius arms. So with radius arms, you're bolting on to the factory wedges that are on the Dana 44. So using Dana 44, basically, yeah, you have to use the 76 to 79 F-150 front axle. So it's wider, the axle is wider. So where your radius arms clamp on, the arms come down, and you can either tie them in, you can take the factory arm, you can cut it off and put DOM on the end of it with a knuckle or a link. Lots of companies, they make extended radius arms, so then those will extend and come back, and you can make little brackets, mounts for those. But using that kind of system, you've got the up travel is right up until that diff, that pumpkin is buried right up into where the starter is, basically. And the axle tubes can hit the frame. So if you're trying to do a low truck, so maybe you've got 4 inches of up travel before it hits something, but still have a low truck, but then lots of down travel, with the radius arms being on the bit wider, even coming into maybe mounting on the outside of the frame, and then your springs, everything being on the outside. There's nothing in between other than the diff and the tubes. There's no links in there, there's no springs in there. So you've got the most up travel you can get, so you can keep your truck much lower to the ground. So that's a benefit sometimes if you're towing. For me, that's why I would like that system. Or also if you are rock crawling. A lot of these rock crawlers, they really like them low. They'll cut out their fender wells, keep the truck nice and low, because if you've ever been on a steep side hill or off center on a rock, you know the feeling of being way up in the air, lifted. It's tippy, and it's just a real bad feeling in your stomach. That's my idea. That's what I want to do. I'm going to go with the radius arms, and that's the plan. But as you can see, I bought the axles. I've got a few other little bits and pieces that we can talk about in part 2. But I really wanted to get your feedback, so I'm hoping you'll watch this video, listen to what I said, and then let me know what you think, especially if you've actually done it. If you've installed straight axle, and then how you've done it. Please tell me in the comments, or if you know somebody that's done it. Because if I've got something wrong in my head here, I want to know right now before I go and buy all the expensive parts, get it all in there, cut off my IFS, and then then you're kind of hooped, because the way that you wanted to do it is completely not going to work. We're going to get into it. We're going to talk a little bit about steering, how to make the steering work, different systems, rebuilding these suckers. I really appreciate you watching the video. Send it to somebody if you think that they know a little bit about this sort of thing. And I appreciate any of the feedback I can get from there. If you're interested in solid axle swapping your Ranger, stay tuned, because we're going to talk about it. We're going to go through it, and then I'll show you how I put these if I do, into my truck. Thanks again for watching. Please comment, like, and subscribe, and we will see you in the next video.